Dear participants, the EFFECT project team warmly welcomes you to this first module on Introduction to Evidence-Based Policymaking in Education. Successfully completing this first module will allow you to first define what evidence-based policy is, second, learn about and describe the policy cycle, third, include evidence into the policy cycle so you will be able to describe where evidence intervenes in the policy cycle, and fourth, learn practical matters of evidence. For instance, how to communicate evidence to a broader public, for instance, how to assess evidence, how to be sure that the evidence you might be confronted to in your everyday work is actually evidence and evidence of quality. The successful completion of this first module will allow you to master the difference between evidence-based and evidence-informed policy and to know their main theoretical foundations. You will get fundamental knowledge of economic concepts that are relevant for evidence-based policymaking, such as the concept of opportunity costs. You will get an overview over different sources of evidence and a first idea on how to assess them. You will know how to access evidence and data, and you will learn about how to communicate this evidence to the broader public. Dear participants, welcome to this first submodule on describing and defining evidence-based policy, which will set the stage for the following submodules. Evidence-based policy can be explained by drawing an analogy to evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based medicine is an important decision-making rule in current-day medicine, which means to use the best evidence currently known, the experience of medical practitioners, and the values of either the patient or the public. The combination of these three elements shall provide the best decision possible. Similarly to evidence-based medicine, evidence-based policy aims to combine citizens' expectations, values, and beliefs with the best scientific evidence for policymaking. Therefore, policies should not only be based on citizens' preferences, but also on best scientific evidence, and the combination of these two elements should lead to an optimal policymaking. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.2, which is the first submodule on the policy cycle. The aim of the policy cycle is to illustrate the life cycle of policies, their decisions and implementations. The policy cycle consists of 7 steps. In the first step, the agenda is set. In the second step, the policy is discussed. In the third step, the policy is formed. In the fourth step, the policy needs to be accepted. In the fifth step, means are provided, while the policy is implemented in the sixth step and evaluated in the seventh step. Let us first focus on the agenda setting. At the agenda setting stage, issues are identified that policymakers will focus on. At this stage, 3 actors can intervene, namely the media, scientific evidence, and social media. While the media can frame discussions and spread information, scientific evidence is often less taken into consideration at this stage. However, the media might use scientific evidence to legitimize and thus strengthen their point of view. Social media may lead to reverse agenda setting. This means that the public, by pushing a given topic on social media, can contribute to the agenda setting process. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.3, which is the second submodule on the policy cycle. In this submodule, we will focus on the stages of policy discussion, policy formation, and policy acceptance. Let us first set the stage again. During the agenda setting stage of the policy cycle, policymakers have identified an issue they want to tackle. And now, during the policy discussion stage, they debate on policy options to effectively address this issue. During the policy formation stage, they describe the steps that are required to implement their chosen policy. And during the policy acceptance stage, the policy needs to be voted by political representatives, but also needs to be accepted by the general public. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.4, which is the third submodule on the policy cycle and tackles the provision of means, the implementation and evaluation stages of the policy cycle. Let's start with a quick recap of what has happened so far in the life cycle of a policy. We have first started by identifying an issue in the agenda setting stage, for which we have searched a solution or policy solution in the policy discussion stage. In the policy formation stage, we have then detailed this policy and we made sure that the policy is accepted by the public in the policy acceptance stage. Now, in the provision of means stage, we decide on how to optimally provide human and financial resources to implement the policy. We detail how many people we need. We detail how many financial resources we need. We detail how many material resources we need. And then, in the policy implementation stage, we effectively implement the public policy before evaluating it in the evaluation stage. Let's consider the example of the EU policy cycle, which has been defined in a European Parliament briefing as follows. In the first stage, it sets long-term objectives, which is the agenda setting stage. In the second stage, it calls for action by other EU institutions, which is the policy formulation stage. In the third stage, it endorses actions of other EU institutions, which is the stage of affirming ownership. And in the fourth stage, it assesses policy implementation at European and at national levels, which is the scrutiny stage. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.5, which is the first submodule on evidence in the policy cycle. Indeed, as this module is on introducing evidence-based policy making in education, we will now have a look at how evidence can be introduced into the policy cycle that we have discussed during the last submodules. Here we see again a representation of the policy cycle. But how can evidence be introduced into it? That's what we will discuss during this and following submodules. We will start by a more detailed look at the agenda setting stage. At the agenda setting stage, the media might use scientific evidence to legitimize their point when they frame discussions. Or put otherwise, scientific evidence might not have such a direct impact on agenda setting, but it might be possible that scientific evidence produces a relevant finding, which is then taken up by the media, put forward, and influences the agenda setting process that way. We're now having a closer look at the use of evidence in the policy formation and policy acceptance stage. The policy formation stage might be shaped through the use of predictive analytics or scenario techniques, while the policy acceptance stage might be shaped by analyses to analyze the acceptance of given policy options among parts of the population. Using survey data, for instance, we could get an idea of how well a given policy option would be received by the population or parts of the population. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.6, which is the second submodule on evidence in the policy cycle. Let us now have a closer look at how evidence can be introduced into the provision of means stage, for instance, through evidence on costs. Because if now we want to introduce a policy, this will generate costs. But if we have evidence on the costs, on the one hand, this will increase transparency, and on the other hand, this will reduce adverse selection. Imagine that, for instance, you would like to introduce a policy in the education field, and the school would then claim their cost to be higher than it really is. If now you have evidence on costs, you know what the cost should be, and this way you can avoid a school or any other regulated firm to claim their costs to be higher than it actually is. When it comes to policy implementation, evidence can help us a lot as well. Imagine that we have problem areas in a given city, areas which suffer from crime. But if now we have evidence on where these areas are, we could just increase the presence of the police in these areas. So evidence in the policy implementation stage helps us to understand and to get information on where policy is needed the most. Last but not least, evidence can also have an impact on policy evaluation. For instance, if we base our criteria on evidence, this will allow an objective measurement of some previously fixed indicators whether the policy indeed has an impact or does not. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.7, in which we will apply the theoretical knowledge we have previously gained to the case of Flemish summer schools during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our case study will be based on the chapter The Pandemic, Socioeconomic Disadvantage and Learning Outcomes in Belgium, published by Professor Christophe de Witte and Letizia Gambi. Let us first have a look at the setting of the Belgian education system. Belgium is a federal state, and the Belgian education system is therefore federalized as well. More precisely, 58% of the student population are enrolled in schools which are affiliated with the Flemish community of Belgium, 41% of the student population are enrolled in schools affiliated with the French community of Belgium, and 1% of the student population are enrolled in schools which are affiliated with the German-speaking community of Belgium. As you can see on this slide, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, schools were closed on the 16th of March 2020, followed by a complete lockdown the following day. Schools remained closed during the month of April, and from the 15th of May on, there was a partial reopening of schools. This reopening happened in two phases. During the first phase, which started on the 15th of May 2020 for the Flemish community and the 18th of May 2020 for the French community, only the final grades of the primary and secondary school re-attended school in a face-to-face learning setting for 2 full days or 4 half days at the maximum. During the second phase, which started at the 8th of June 2020, face-to-face learning resumed in primary schools. This led to a situation in which the school was closed during 9 weeks for students of the final grades of primary and secondary school, and during 12 weeks for the remaining student population. The problems resulting from this situation were that not much new course material has been covered during the school closure period, or no new material at all, and that there was a poor ICT integration in the Belgian education system. However, ICTs are crucial for remote learning. The evidence, or consensus in the literature, further shows that the summer holiday of 8 to 9 weeks has a negative effect on students' learning. We will discuss the policy response that the Flemish community implemented during the next submodule, but you are invited to already think of the policy response that the Flemish community might have implemented in your exercise. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.8, in which we will continue the case study that we started during the last submodule on the Flemish summer schools during the COVID-19 pandemic. As has been discussed during the last submodule, the problems arising from the COVID-19 situation were that not much new course material has been covered during the school closure period, or no new material at all, and that there was a poor ICT integration in the Belgian education system. The evidence further showed that summer holidays of 8 to 9 weeks have a negative effect on students' learning. The Flemish community implemented a policy response, which was the financial support for summer schools in 2020 and 2021 by 21.8 million euros, and in 2022 by 10 million euros. In their article, The Uphill Battle, The Amplifying Effects of Negative Trends in Test Scores, COVID-19 School Closures and Teacher Shortages, Professor de Witte and Letizia Gambi conduct an impact evaluation of this Flemish policy response. They find that, thanks to summer schools, the test scores in mathematics in 2022 regained the same level as they had in 2019, so a pre-COVID level, while they also found that in Dutch, where COVID actually led to a decline in school test scores, this decline was much less outspoken for schools that participated in the summer schools compared to schools which did not participate in the summer schools. So they were able to establish that summer schools were able to weaken the negative impact of school closures during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.9, in which we will start discussing potential dilemmas that evidence-based policy making in education might face. To do so, let us reconsider the study conducted by Professor De Witte and Letizia Gambi and ask ourselves why they have limited their analysis to the Flemish community. Why didn't they include the French-speaking or German-speaking community into their analysis as well? The reason behind this is simple and is given by the authors themselves, who state that, in contrast with the Flemish community in other OECD countries, the French and German-speaking communities have limited access to data and educational quality and have inadequate evaluation capacity at both the central and school levels. And this is an example of a first potential dilemma of evidence-based policy making in education. This first dilemma are data gaps, meaning that for some phenomena in some countries or some regions for which you would like to have evidence, the data that is required to have this evidence might just not be available. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.10, in which we will continue our discussion of the potential dilemmas that evidence-based policymaking in education might face. To do so, let's have a look at another case study, which is based on the article Sugar Rush or Sugar Crash, Experimental Evidence on the Impact of Sugary Drinks in the Classroom, published by Dr. Fritz Schils and Professor Christoph de Witte, who found that sugary drinks first relaxes boys and then makes them restless, but has no impact on girls. Based on the findings described by Dr. Schils and Professor de Witte, let us formulate the following naive policy proposal to ban sugary drink vending machines at school. This policy proposal might seem like a good idea at first, but it might also be opposed because, as mentioned Dr. Schils and Professor de Witte, school principals are often the staunchest opponents to the removal of vending machines, as the profits gained by selling these drinks are vital for many highly underfunded schools, which illustrates another potential dilemma. This dilemma consists in the management of the interests of different actors. Indeed, policy involves many different actors who might have many different interests, and policymakers then need to manage all these interests. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.11, which is the third submodule on potential dilemmas of evidence-based policymaking in education. In this submodule, we will have a look at another case study, which is the article Can Grants Affect Student Performance? Evidence from 5 Italian Universities, published by Dr. Graziosi and colleagues, who found that students receiving a grant first are more likely to graduate and second are less likely to drop out. In the article, the authors ask if financial aid should be directed towards enlarging the number of beneficiaries while maintaining the same requirements for merit, which would improve the equity of interventions, or whether it should instead focus more on giving wider incentives but to a more restricted group of excellent students, which would increase the merit requirements for obtaining a grant. The authors also highlight that the analysis that they propose cannot answer this directly, and much of this discussion relies upon different political perspectives, and this leads to another dilemma. This third dilemma consists in the fact that different political positions may allow different interpretations of empirical findings. Based on one's position at the political spectrum, one might interpret empirical findings differently, and thus see or not see a need for policy intervention. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.12, which is the fourth submodule on potential dilemmas in evidence-based policy making in education. This submodule will be based on a case study based on the article The Effectiveness of a Computer-Assisted Math Learning Program, published by Professor de Witte, Professor Helemans, and Professor Rogge in the Journal of Computer-Assisted Learning. Professor de Witte and colleagues based their study on the educational software Got It, which offers many exercises at different levels of difficulty and thus allows every student to advance at their own pace. Using this software, they were able to establish that doing more exercises leads to better test scores. Based on their findings, the authors of the article arrive at the following policy recommendation. The results of this paper also suggest that policymakers can more actively encourage the use of ICT for schools with poor learning outcomes or with a diverse student population. As the ICT hardware is nowadays available in most schools, ICT should be used in the most effective and efficient way. This paper shows that adaptive CAI tools might be an effective tool to increase learning outcomes. We will further discuss this policy recommendation in the following submodule. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.13, in which we will continue our analysis that we started in the last submodule. In this submodule, we will confront our previously gained insights to the findings of Schwanenberg and colleagues, who conducted a survey among school directors in 9 federal states in Germany, inter alia on challenges in the use of ICT in education. As you can see in this graphical representation of the results found by Schwanenberg and colleagues, school principals perceive the most intense challenge of ICT use in German schools to be the infrastructural issues. Let's now discuss this case study while confronting it with the case study from last time. In the case study from the last submodule, Professor de Witte, Professor Helemans, and Professor Rogge called for the ICT use which is the most effective and efficient, as the ICT hardware is nowadays available in most schools. However, Schwanenberg and colleagues know that in the German context, this infrastructure might be simply absent, which thus leads to another dilemma. This fourth dilemma can be described as follows. The suggestions made by evidence might not be feasible, at least not at short term, due to a lack of material, a lack of personnel, a lack of financial resources, etc., etc. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.14, which is the sixth submodule on potential dilemmas in evidence-based policymaking in education. Today's submodule is based on a case study, namely the article The Potential of Tutoring in Higher Education, Students' Preferences, Consumption and the Role of Information, published by Willem de Kort and Professor de Witte, who found that publicly providing tutoring could also increase social mobility. Students without a higher educated father have a stronger preference for tutoring but are unable to purchase tutoring on the private market because they are more sensitive to the high prices. Based on the findings described by Willem de Kort and Professor de Witte, let us again establish a naive policy proposal, namely to increase public funding for tutoring in higher education. To evaluate this first naive policy proposal, we will need two important concepts, with the first one being the concept of cost-benefit analysis that will be covered in more detail in Module 4. So everything you will learn in this first module on cost-benefit analysis will be deepened in Module 4. The main idea of cost-benefit analysis is that the social benefits of a policy must exceed its social costs. Another important concept is the concept of opportunity cost. In economics, the opportunity cost is what an individual gives up in terms of utility when choosing one alternative over another alternative. For example, think about the situation when you need to buy new office material. You might have the choice between two different screens for your computer. You might have a bigger screen, which is more expensive, and you might have a smaller screen, which would be cheaper. You do not only pay the financial costs, which would be the price you pay for your screen, but you also pay an opportunity cost. If you choose the smaller screen, you might save in terms of financial cost, but you might lose in terms of opportunity cost. If you need a big screen for your work, then you might save right now by choosing the smaller screen in terms of financial costs, but in the same time, over the next 5 years, you might lose in terms of opportunity cost because you would have gained more utility from using the bigger screen compared to using the smaller screen. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.15, which is the seventh submodule on potential dilemmas in evidence-based policymaking in education. In the last submodule, we have established a naive policy proposal that we now want to evaluate using cost-benefit analysis. We're now having a closer look at costs. Costs can uncover funding costs, social costs, or possible opportunity costs. We have covered the concept of opportunity costs in the last submodule. Let me remind you that the opportunity cost is what an individual gives up in terms of utility when choosing a given option over an alternative. For example, if you need to buy a new computer screen and you buy a smaller one than the one you would actually need, then you might save in terms of financial costs, but you might lose in terms of opportunity costs because you would have gained more utility from using a bigger screen than the smaller screen you eventually chose. Let us keep in mind that during the last submodule, we established a policy proposal to increase funding for tutoring in higher education. However, there are many other alternative possibilities where this funding could be used, such as increased funding for university hospital, increased funding for scientific communication, provide funding for new research project. As you can see, there's a huge number of potential investment opportunities for funds, and therefore it is difficult to allocate funds to every project, and there is a need for trade-off. The opportunity costs would therefore mean spending money on better tutoring implies not to spend more money on the university hospital, if, of course, we assume that these two institutions get funding from the same budget authority, and such choices might politically not be feasible. Therefore, we can add a fifth dilemma to our list of potential dilemmas for evidence-based policymaking, which is that the suggestions made by evidence might politically not be feasible. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.16, which is the first module on dilemmas and the policy cycle. In this submodule and the following submodules, we will link each previously discussed dilemma to the policy cycle. Let us start with the first dilemma we identified, which is the dilemma on data gaps. This dilemma might influence the agenda setting stage, the policy discussion stage, the provision of means stage, and the evaluation stage. In the agenda setting stage, for instance, a lack of data might make it more difficult to defend a given policy proposal. In the policy discussion stage, options might be more difficult to compare with a lack of data. In the provision of means stage, a lack of data on available means would make it more difficult to plan that provision. If you do not have any data on how many personal, financial resources, material you have, of course it will be more difficult for you to adequately plan a policy implementation. And finally, the evaluation stage can be impacted if data on the indicators is difficult to get. Let us now move to the second dilemma, which is the management of interests of different actors. This dilemma might impact the agenda setting stage, the policy discussion stage, the policy acceptance stage, and the provision of means stage. In the agenda setting stage, conflicting interests expressed in media or social media might hinder the correct identification of issues. If, for instance, you have the public posting many different topics on social media, then it might be more difficult to identify the ones which are actually urgent. In the policy discussion stage, different options often lead to conflicting interests, and therefore these interests must be managed. The policy acceptance stage might be impacted as, depending on their political stance, some groups might be in favor or opposed to a given policy. So some groups, depending on whether they are in favor or opposed to a given policy, have different interests. And as a policymaker, you will need to manage these interests in order for each group to be heard. The provision of means stage might be impacted if financial or human resources are relocated from another policy or project to this new policy or project, because this might hinder the other project. If you are relocating financial resources from project A to project B, then project A might have trouble to advance. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.17, in which we will continue to link the previously identified dilemmas to the policy cycle. We now address the third dilemma, which is that different political positions may allow different interpretations of empirical finding. This dilemma might impact the agenda setting stage, the policy discussion stage, and the policy evaluation stage. The agenda setting stage might be impacted as, depending on the political stance, empirical findings can be considered as either proving a need for policy action or not being relevant. So if, for instance, a given group is per se in favor of implementing a given policy, then this group might consider some empirical finding to be proving a need for policy action, while another political group, which might be more opposed to this policy, might just claim that this evidence is not really proving any need for action. The policy discussion stage might be impacted as different options favoring different political positions might be suggested based on different interpretations of the same empirical finding. As we have previously discussed, different groups might interpret empirical findings differently, and therefore different groups might also propose other policies based on the empirical findings. If they are more in favor of, for instance, pushing more regulation forward, then they might use the empirical finding to ask for more regulation, while as groups that are more in favor of less regulation, so of a more liberal environment, then this group might use the empirical finding to advocate more liberalization. The evaluation stage can also be impacted. Depending on the political position and on whether this position initially supported the policy or not, the evaluation can be interpreted optimistically or pessimistically. Let's consider the following example. If we imagine that a policy wanted to achieve a reduction in school dropout by 20%, but only achieved a 10% reduction, the political group who initially was in favor of the policy could optimistically claim that the objectives had been partially achieved. However, the political group which was initially against the policy could argue that the policy did not achieve what it initially promised and therefore was ineffective. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.18, in which we will continue to link the previously identified dilemmas to the policy cycle. Let us start with dilemma 4, that the suggestions made by evidence might not be feasible, at least not at short term. This dilemma impacts the policy discussion stage, the policy formation stage, and the provision of means stage. The policy discussion stage might be impacted if, even though an issue has been identified in the agenda setting stage, the policy options are not feasible. So actually, an issue has been identified, but all the alternatives of policies that might solve this issue cannot be implemented. The policy formation stage might be impacted if a policy option turns out to be not feasible, and the provision of means stage might be impacted if there is a lack of means, financial means, personal means, material means, which are required to effectively implement the policy. Let us finish this submodule by dilemma 5. The suggestions made by evidence might politically not be feasible. This dilemma might impact the policy acceptance stage if, even if the means and feasible policy options exist, the feasible policy option cannot be justified towards the public. So we have a feasible policy option, but which cannot be justified towards the public for political reasons, ethical reasons, logistical reasons, or whatever other reason it may be. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.19, in which we will do a slight paradigm shift from evidence-based to evidence-informed policy. Indeed, evidence-informed policy aims to respond to some extent to previous dilemmas. We started from the assumption that scientific evidence should drive public policy making. However, evidence might not be interpreted in the same way. There might be conflicting interests. Projects suggested by evidence might not be feasible. And therefore, what would happen if policy making was evidence-informed rather than evidence-based? And this is indeed a more realistic approach in many situations. Evidence-informed policy can be used in policy discussions to provide a solid foundation, to identify potential policies or policy options, or when taking the actual decision. But how does evidence-informed policy actually impact the policy cycle? First, when identifying issues that policymakers will focus on, which is the agenda setting stage, scientific evidence can be useful to inform policymakers on current issues and help them to prioritize the issues if this is needed. Furthermore, in the policy discussion stage, when debating on options, relying on evidence will be crucial to support arguments. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.20, in which we will identify possible sources of evidence. Let us first introduce a differentiation of types of evidence. So far, we have only considered evidence as a uniform concept, but this is not very accurate. There are many types of evidence, and each one has strengths and weaknesses. A characterization can be made based on the sources of evidence, and we will present here the characterization provided by a European Commission support from the DG Structural Reform Support. First, institutions might provide evidence. These institutions might be governmental institutions, such as research units, scientific agencies, statistical offices, or internal audits. These institutions might also be independent public institutions, such as public research institutes, national banks, regulatory agencies, or non-governmental institutions, such as universities, private research institutions, think tanks, consultancy, or similar agencies. Evidence can also be provided by experts. These experts often come from non-governmental institutions and are able to provide evidence based on their work and representation in organizations. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.21, in which we will continue our previously started classification of the sources of evidence. Evidence might also be provided by information sources, such as academic research publications, books, papers, or articles, or also research conducted by non-academic actors, such as impact assessment conducted by regulatory agencies, evaluations of public policies and programs, or consultancy and audit reports. Other information sources of evidence might be science projects conducted by citizens, data, or statistics. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.22, in which we will start classifying different types of evidence. Over the last two submodules, we have seen different sources providing evidence, and each source may tend to provide different types of evidence, with each type of evidence having their advantages and disadvantages, and therefore this submodule first analyzes the types of scientific evidence more in depth before continuing with other types of evidence. Types of scientific knowledge are given by causal reasoning, models, and measurements, and each one of these types will be discussed more in detail. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.23, in which we will continue to categorize different types of evidence. In this submodule, we will have a closer look at methods of causal reasoning. Let us first define what causal reasoning actually means. The main idea of causal reasoning is to show that the impact was indeed caused by the intervention and is not simply correlated with the groups treated by the intervention. Imagine that you organize an intensive training program in economics for all the secondary school students in your country. But then, if afterwards you observe indeed an increase in students' performance in economics, how can you be sure that this was indeed caused by your intensive training program? Or put otherwise, correlation is not causality, and in causal reasoning, we aim to prove causality. Causal reasoning can be backed by many different methods. One of them are randomized controlled trials, which are also known as the gold standard in impact evaluation. These randomized controlled trials are based on the random assignment of interventions to treatment and control groups and validate the comparison and make it possible to attribute the impact to the intervention. There exist also other methods of causal reasoning, such as non-randomized controlled trials, quasi-experimental settings, which we will cover in Module 3, in which the randomization is only mimicked, and observational studies, which are based on pure observations. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.24, in which we will continue our classification of different types of evidence. In this submodule, we will have a closer look at measurements. Measurements can be made in many different ways, but measurements are generally considered valid if there is an appropriate measurement. Standardized measurement methods are used if such standardized methods are available, and if the measurement is correctly reported. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.25, in which we'll continue our classification of different types of evidence. In this and the following submodule, we will focus on models and model simulations. Sometimes experiments, measurements, and observations cannot really explain a phenomenon, and in such cases, confronting this phenomenon to what theory would predict can be useful. This is what model simulations are made for, and we will see how a model simulation will look like in the next submodule. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.26, in which we will, through an example, explain how model simulations work. To do so, let us consider the following example. Imagine you have a huge number of school dropouts in your nation, your region, your village, and you want to implement a policy response. However, no experimental or observational study was able to explain this phenomenon of school dropouts so far, and thus you can rely on theoretical models in education economics. Indeed, the literature provides a decision rule on whether to stay at school or to drop out. Precisely, Dr. Kabus and Professor De Witte presented an economic model explaining students' dropout decision. They indicated students stay at school if the quotient of their utility of schooling divided by their total utility is bigger than the utility derived from the intrinsic motivation and the opportunity cost from school attendance. Or, put otherwise, students do not drop out as long as the utility they get from going to school allows to compensate their potential dislike and the opportunity cost of schooling. This decision rule provided by the literature is valid on individual level, which means that it allows to explain a dropout decision of one single student. Now, using a computer, we can simulate a population based on the provided model and the parameters of the actual population. So what we actually do is that we simulate a population through a computer code in which we enter the parameters of the real population and then look at what would happen if everyone behaved such as in the model provided by the literature. And then we can use this model simulation as a benchmark to better understand what happens in reality. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.27. After having analyzed the evidence provided by scientific knowledge, we now analyze evidence provided by other sources. Let us start with evidence provided by experts. As shown by Angelo and colleagues, evidence provided by experts might lead to increased trust by citizens. Experts might also provide you a more practical and experience-based insights. For instance, if you have problems to collect data, you might contact an expert who might then tell you that they had exactly the same issue with collecting data, and then they might also tell you how they managed to solve this issue. Experts might also have a better knowledge on the literature on a given topic, which will lead to a huge gain of time in your own analysis. Evidence might also be provided in the form of data by statistical offices. Advantages of such data sets might be that the data is accurate and that you have an official data source. But on the other hand, disadvantages of this data might be that the data might not perfectly suit the exact question to be analyzed, and the data might not be detailed enough. Statistical offices might exist at many different levels, and therefore data can also be obtained on many different levels. We might have international data, such as OECD data. We might have European level data from sources such as Eurostat. We might have national data obtained from national statistical offices. And we also have regional data that we can obtain from regional statistical offices if such offices exist. This is the case in Germany, for instance. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.28, in which we will continue our analysis of different types of evidence. Today we will discuss another type of evidence provided by statistical offices, which are their annual reports. These annual reports might also possibly provide interesting data for policymaking. However, as they often remain quite global, there might be a lack of sufficient detail on the one hand, but they might also be useful to get a first overview over the topic on the other hand. From all the discussions we had so far, we can already conclude that there exist many different types of evidence: detailed evidence versus broad evidence, evidence on specific topics versus evidence providing a general overview, etc., etc. And therefore, among this huge variety, there is a need to assess the evidence we got, and this assessment will be discussed in the following modules. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.29, in which we will learn how to correctly assess evidence. So far, we have seen that evidence can take many different forms, and therefore there might be many pieces of knowledge that might be regarded as evidence, and therefore the question might be asked, how can we assess which evidence is actually helpful in our context? In this context, an article published by Kano and Hayashi shows that not every piece of scientific knowledge is actually equivalent to valid evidence. Kano and Hayashi highlight that scientific knowledge can be regarded as evidence if it is relevant in the context of policymaking. Therefore, scientific knowledge as such does not fulfill the criteria of evidence. What is also needed is this aspect that it can be useful for policymaking. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.30, in which we will continue our discussion on how to assess evidence. A first evaluation framework would be the Crele concept, developed by Cash and colleagues. Crele is an abbreviation for credibility, relevance, and legitimacy, which are the three main concepts of the Crele framework. But what do these three concepts actually mean? Credibility means that the evidence is scientifically accurate, so scientifically correct. Relevance means that the evidence is relevant for decision makers' needs, and legitimate means that the information gathering has been fair and respected the values of different stakeholders. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.31, in which we will continue our discussion on how to correctly assess evidence. The article published by Kano and Hayashi that we discussed 2 submodules ago describes some perspectives to assess the evidence policy interaction. One of these perspectives is methodological rigorousness. However, the criteria when a study is methodologically rigorous depends a lot on the study itself. If the study is a causal reasoning study, then the use of causal inference and the use of causal methods are crucial. If the study is a model simulation, this simulation must be valid and the quality of proxy data must be ensured. And finally, if the study relies on measurements, then these measurements must be reliable. For instance, they need to respect standardization. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.32, in which we will continue to learn how to correctly assess evidence. As we have discussed during the last submodule, the article published by Kano and Hayashi provides some perspectives to assess the evidence-policy interaction. One of these aspects is consistency. The idea of consistency, such as described by Kano and Hayashi, consists of pieces of evidence supported by other pieces of evidence, which are on their turn supported by again other pieces of evidence, such to form some kind of a grid in which each piece of evidence is supported by one or many other pieces of evidence. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.33, in which we'll continue to learn and deepen our knowledge on assessing evidence. Let us again base ourselves on the article published by Kano and Hayashi, and more precisely on the proximity concept, which is a relative measure of distance between policy issues, or meaning to which extent the evidence and our specific situation are comparable. If now we have a between domains proximity, the evidence is applied to different contexts, but at the same level. For instance, if we use findings that were relevant in primary schools in China to apply them to primary schools in Chile. If we have system-to-domain proximity, the evidence is generated in a model and should then be applied to different contexts. For instance, if we use model predictions to apply them to reality. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.34, in which we continue to learn about how to assess evidence. Today's perspective from the Kano and Hayashi article is the perspective of social appropriateness, which means that evidence is produced and used while considering social, ethical, and legal issues. Let us in this context also discuss the notion of inductive risk. When scientists take a decision, they should include the social consequences of their judgment into their decision, which is actually a good guideline for policymakers as well. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.35, in which we will finish to learn about how to assess evidence. The last perspective from the Kano and Hayashi article is the legitimacy perspective, which requires that the decision must be politically legitimate. To verify whether a decision was politically legitimate, one may ask to what extent political aspects played a role when considering evidence. However, in some situations there might be a democratic dilemma, because some decisions require expertise and therefore an involvement of experts. On the one hand, we thus have a reduction of democracy, because decisions are co-taken not only by representatives of the public, but also by non-elected experts. But on the other hand, this expert involvement leads to better decision-making. An example cited by Kano and Hayashi is that in the United States, victims of nuclear fallout have been excluded from studies on the correlation between low-dose radiation exposure and thyroid cancer, which is an example of how political considerations played a role in these studies. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.36, in which we will discuss multi-level governance in education policy. As we already discussed, there is no single type of evidence, but the government does not exist either. In particular, in the European context, there are many different levels of governance with many different stakeholders, which might be European, national, regional, local, etc. And this leads to a need to discuss multi-level governance in education policy. Let's first have a look at the role of the European Union. The European Union plays a supportive role, which means that it encourages the exchange of best practices and cooperation between member states and organizes initiatives such as Erasmus+, the development of a network of European universities, and funding provision. For instance, the EFFECT project is also funded by the European Union. Education policy is a national or regional competence, depending on the country. Some countries have education as a rather national competence. Examples include France or Luxembourg. Other countries have education as a rather regional competence, such as Germany or Belgium, for example. This graph shows where the decision-making in OECD schools actually happens. It can be seen that competencies lie on very different levels, from the Netherlands, where schools have a huge weight in decision-making, compared to France, where a huge part of decisions are taken on a state level. There is a broad variety in education systems in the EU and in the OECD as well. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.37, in which we will start discussing how to communicate evidence. This discussion will be based on a case study, namely the article A Summary to Communicate Evidence from Systemic Reviews to the Public, Improved Understanding and Accessibility of Information, a randomized controlled trial published by Santesso and colleagues, who found that how evidence is communicated has an impact on how well it is understood. Let us also note that to establish these findings, Santesso and colleagues used a randomized controlled trial, which is a method that we will discover in the following. The first format on which Santesso and colleagues focus in their study is the plaintext summary format, which provides a qualitative description of effects in a paragraph of text and does not have a criteria for the flow of information. You can see an example of the PTS on this slide. Santesso and colleagues compare this PTS format to a format that they have newly introduced. Their new format provides some type of a question and answer format, provides information on the quality of evidence via the grade framework on the bottom of the page, provides quantitative results in a table, and adds a quantitative dimension to the qualitative description. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.38, in which we will continue to learn about how to communicate evidence. Let's start with a quick look on the experimental setting used by Santesso and colleagues. Indeed, they randomized participants into either a treatment group, which receives their new format, or a control group, which receives the old PTS format. You will learn more about randomized control trials in the second module, but let's already note that randomized control trials allow to establish the impact of an intervention on the treatment group. Put otherwise, the randomization allows Santesso and colleagues to be able to claim afterwards that it was indeed the new format that caused a better understanding. And indeed, significantly more respondents understood the evidence, even when taking the education level, language, and internet experience into account. Respondents also considered the information more accessible, more reliable, easier to understand, and more helpful for decision making. The general conclusion of the study was that respondents preferred the format to which they were exposed first. Let's take a moment to reflect on this study. On the one hand, the study has some limitations, such as that it is for medicine, and therefore medical findings might not be 100% transferable to education economics, and that the study is from 2015, and that new findings might have been established in the meantime. However, the study also allows us to gain some insights, such as that presentation matters, and that visual information might be really useful. However, we should also pay attention on biases. Respondents preferred the formats to which they were exposed first. So might there be a cognitive bias? Might respondents possibly prefer a format which might not be that easy to understand only because it was their first exposure? Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.39, in which we will start to have a precise look at how evidence is used in European education policy. So far, we have discussed numerous aspects related to evidence-based policy, but rather from a theoretical lens. To also provide you a rather applied perspective, some examples of evidence use in European education policy will be discussed in the following. The first example is the EU Learning Lab, which is active in policy evaluation, capacity building, and constructing evidence. It offers technical assistance, technical support, and courses, and exchanges best practices. It translates evidence into policy-relevant conclusions, supports Horizon Europe funding, and supports member states which ask for OECD country review on education. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.40, in which we'll continue to consider some examples of evidence use in European education policy. The first example we consider today is the evaluation of the Erasmus Plus program, which was an evidence-based program evaluation conducted in July 2025. This slide includes some examples of impacts that could be obtained from the evaluation of this program, such as the effect on skill development, the impact on digital skills, the impact on sustainability, or the impact on democratic values. Another example would be the question of how to tackle teacher shortages. In a European Commission report co-authored by Professor De Witte, Letizia Gambi, and Willem de Kort, they recommended to increase the use of hybrid teachers, facilitate task differentiation, and introduce a multi-level career structure. The report was written by 3 researchers from KU Leuven, and indeed, research institutions can be great partners to build evidence ecosystems. Therefore, feel free to collaborate with universities, think tanks, etc. to collect and analyze evidence in policymaking. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.41, in which we will start to have a closer look at where to find evidence. Indeed, you have learned and understood during this whole Module 1 how evidence can be introduced into policymaking, and therefore, before ending this module, some resources will be presented where you can find further resources or evidence whenever you need it. A first interesting institution in this context would be the Joint Research Centre EU Science Hub, which offers publications, databases, and has access to laboratories. Another interesting resource would be the European Education Training Expert Panel report, which you can access by clicking on the File button on the right of this slide. The Info button just below will guide you to a description of the European Education and Training Expert Panel provided by Parents International, which is one of the EFFECT partners. The European Education and Training Expert Panel provides expert opinions on demographic challenges, inclusion, citizenship, technological change, the future of work, digitalization of society, environmental challenges, investment, reforms, and governance. So really plenty of resources that you can access. Dear participants, welcome to submodule 1.42, in which we will finish our small overview on where to find evidence. A possible source of evidence would be the European University Association, which provides briefings, policy inputs, position papers, conferences, annual reports, and expert voices. However, due to its nature, the European University Association mostly provides information on tertiary education. The OECD Education GPS can provide you with country-level data and education policy reviews. Last but not least, Euridice is composed of 43 national units and provides comparative reports, data and visuals, and description of national education systems. Before finishing Module 1, please find on this and the following slides all the resources used to develop this first module on evidence-based policymaking in education. The EFFECT team thanks you for having completed Module 1 on evidence-based policymaking in education and hopes to welcome you soon for Module 2 on randomized control trials. If there are any remaining questions, suggestions, etc. regarding this module, please feel free to contact Professor Dr. Christoph de Witte, who is the main coordinator of EFFECT and the director of the Lehr Research Group at KU Leuven.